Hello, my name is Bob Cahill, representing the Interstate Task Force on Human Relations. The mission of our task force is to work for racial and religious tolerance and against racial and religious discrimination in all its forms. Today's show is one of a series of shows identifying and responding to problems of racial and religious discrimination in our society. We hope you will find the show and the series as a whole informative and otherwise helpful to you in coming to terms and to grips with racial and religious discrimination in your community.
Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we bring you the third in a 7-week series on the topic Racism, Prejudices, and Progress. Our guest today is from Washington, D.C., Mr. Joel Mandelman. He has a very long background in government service. First of all, he has a baccalaureate degree from the City College of New York. He received his law degree from the University of Indiana, and he is a member of both the New York and Washington, D.C. bars. He served also as legal counsel to Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming. He then became assistant counsel to the Toxic Substance Division of the EPA. At the present time, he is the Deputy General Counsel for the United States Civil Rights Commission. He has been on our campus today, as our other guests have been throughout this week, to discuss this topic, racism, prejudices, and progress. We've invited him to the program today to discuss public policy in the area of civil rights. Welcome to our program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tony. I really enjoy it. It's been a wonderful day.
We're also very happy to welcome to the panel 3 members to question our guest today on this very important topic. First of all, I would introduce State Senator Mary Lou Reed. Next to her is Dr. Dennis Connors, who is the Director of Planning and Associate Dean of Instruction at North Idaho College. And our third panel member is State Representative Jeannie Givens. I would invite Mary Lou Reed to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Joel, earlier this week, Julian Bond accused the Reagan administration of trying to undo the laws and the policies that have emerged from the civil rights movement. What is your response to Senator Bond's remarks?
Well, quite to the contrary. It's our view that it's Senator Bond and people who share his views that are undoing the gains of the civil rights movement. The Reagan administration's policy is simply a belief in equality of opportunity. Senator Bond and his followers seem to believe in quotas and reverse discrimination, which are 2 items explicitly prohibited by the 1964 Civil Rights Act and by every Civil Rights Act that's come in the subsequent years. What we are trying to do is preserve equality of opportunity. They want some form of governmentally commanded equality of result. That is, you will get whatever you get because of the group you belong to, rather than because of your own individual accomplishment.
What do you mean by reverse discrimination? That's kind of a phrase of art now. What does it really mean?
Well, I think to everybody, whichever side of the issue you are on, it means quotas. It means saying that, let's say in college admissions, 10% of the people who are admitted to medical school have to be black, 5% have to be Asian, 5% have to be American Indian, 25% have to be women, and that people are admitted based upon their membership in one of these groups rather than being admitted based on their grade point averages and their test scores.
Is it the Reagan administration position then that white males in the United States are being discriminated against because of the quota systems that are in effect?
Yes, it is our position that these so-called new civil rights policies that are advocated by people like Senator Bond really are creating a new class of victims of discrimination. In this case, white males, yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Connors.
Let's go back to some of the traditional victims, and picked by what you've said this morning, I'd like to, I did a little homework and like to read you a little bit about what I found. Despite dramatic changes, black median income in the early 80s is about 60% of the white median income, just about the way it was in the 1960s. In 1983, the National Assessment of Education Progress estimates that 47% of urban black youth were functionally illiterate. The Center for the Study of Social Policy asserts that 46% of black males over the age of 16 are jobless. 55% of black babies are born to women who are not married. A majority of black families are headed by women, and nearly 70% of black children in these families live in poverty. At the height of the recession, black poverty rate stood at over 35%, compared with 15% for the nation as a whole. And even in the summer of 1984, while the recovery roared ahead, the unemployment rate slipped back to single digits. The black unemployment rate is almost 17%. 500,000 more blacks were unemployed than when Reagan took office. Finally, of 18 million blacks eligible to vote, only about 11.5 are registered. Some would say that that indeed is the case right now. The Reagan administration, from what I understand you're saying, has said there are no racial wrongs anymore that need remedies. Would you react to that?
Well, I think the use of these statistics just totally really distorts the problem. The fact that, for example, their income level is only 60% doesn't mean that you're going to solve that problem with quotas. Quotas aren't going to prevent young black females from having illegitimate children. Quotas have nothing to do with people voting. The Voting Rights Act has been on the books since 1965. It was reenacted in 1982, signed into law by President Reagan. There is simply no legal barrier to any eligible voter registering and voting. And again, the remedies suggested by the Julian bonds, the idea of racially preferential treatment, not going to solve any of these problems or change any of the statistics that you were citing. I think the income statistic, as I was pointing out to someone earlier this afternoon, is somewhat misleading because you've got to look at where the gap is, what the gap was, let's say, 20 years ago, what it is now, item one. Item two, you have to look at how that gap is closing. If you look at the incomes earned by black males who are college graduates versus the incomes, let's say, of white males who are college graduates, you're not going to find this 40% gap. You might find a 10% gap. The point is the numbers are getting better, not worse, and that's all to the good. As to, again, illegitimate children, quotas aren't going to solve that problem. You've got a more fundamental issue of the increasing disintegration of black families. It's an extremely serious problem that no one, black or white, has yet come up with a satisfactory solution to. But that problem has gotten much worse over the last 30 years. There's no question about it.
Tony. Jeannie Gibbons.
Yes, Mr. Mandelman, there's been a lot of talk about opportunity through education for minorities. And I know that you are not, I know that you are often asked to speak directly for the President, and that's not fair at all, but I'd like to know your opinion. With the cutbacks in student aid programs, how can minorities move up the so-called escalator to integrate, to assimilate?
The fact, first of all, I agree with your premise. Education is clearly the way out of all of the problems that David Connors just cited. If you don't have an education, you're never going to get a decent job, no matter what kind of civil rights program you have. There have to be certain minimum qualifications you're going to have to meet. As I explained to a student who raised that same question this morning, the student aid issue is just part of a larger problem of a $200 billion deficit. That deficit is a threat to everybody. Students, parents, teachers, farmers, everyone. Everybody equally has to make some sacrifice. They're cutting back on price supports. We've cut back on mass transit. There have been suggestions that Medicaid be cut back. Every group in society is having to bear some of the burden of helping to close that $200 billion gap. And there is no particular reason why college students should be treated differently than elderly people who need that Social Security or that Medicare as much as that student needs the student loan or as much as a farmer needs price supports. Everybody has to share the burden equally, and that's basically what the administration is trying to do, is spread the impact around so that you didn't, for example, abolish all student loans in order to close the gap or abolish all price supports for agricultural products. Everybody takes a little bit of a cut.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. You say that a college student shouldn't be treated differently. Certainly in your administration you have a priority list in which you say that one area is more important than the other. And I think there are some who feel that the Reagan administration puts defense at gives it a high ranking, a high priority, and perhaps the college student is way, way down the list, especially if the student loans and such are going to be cut. How do you really justify saying that everything is equal, everybody should have a little bit taken away from them, when obviously in this world of limited resources you have to make choices, and where in your choice making do you put the college student?
Well, I can't, again, and you're quite right, I'm not speaking for the administration on this point. As I said, it's a question of trying to treat everybody fairly. Everybody will tell you, of course I'm in favor of cutting the deficit, but cut his program, don't cut mine. You see the same phenomenon going on with tax reform. Everybody says, raise someone else's taxes, don't raise mine, because what I've got is fair, but what he's got isn't fair. It really is like beauty. A lot of it is in the eye of the beholder, and of course the group that is having its program cut will say, I'm different, I should be treated differently, exempt me from the cut me less. Well, you can't win an argument like that. You can never make anybody happy if you do it that way. So the only way to do it and try to be successful, to get it through Congress, is to say, all right, we will treat everybody equally. Let's say we will cut everybody 3% or 5% or whatever it is, but you do it across the board so at least everybody can't say, why am I being singled out for worse treatment? Why did you cut me 10%, you only cut her 2%? It's just a question of the reality of the situation.
Well, then, are you suggesting that education itself is just not a high priority?
No, that is not true at all. I think that's really reading something into what I'm saying that isn't there. It is as important a priority as defense. It is as important a priority as Medicare or Medicaid. It is as important a priority as preserving the family farm. But it is not more important. And the implication of your question seems to be, why isn't that more important than these other things?
The implication is that if you're going to cut back on your civil rights enforcement, then you have to come up with other alternatives. And we are agreeing, I think all of us feel that education is a central way to counter the problems of discrimination.
No, wait a minute. I do not accept that last statement. This administration has not cut back on civil rights enforcement. This administration has taken the position that its views on quotas and reverse discrimination constitute a very effective and meaningful civil rights program. To stop enforcing racial quotas is not to cut back on civil rights enforcement. It's simply that we're saying civil rights means each person is treated equally as an individual, and we will spend every penny that needs to be spent. And we are, in fact, spending more budget-wise than previous administrations did. We will do everything we can to protect every individual's rights, but we are not going to, in any way, say that people are entitled to rights because they belong to a group. And that's not cutting back civil rights enforcement. We have a very different philosophy, one that we think reflects the original intent of the civil rights laws, but we're not cutting back on anything.
Dr. Connors.
Is that what Assistant Attorney General William Bradford Reynolds, who heads the Civil Rights Division, means when he says that affirmative action is immoral?
Yes, because affirmative action has really become a euphemism, or frankly, what we call an Orwellian euphemism, for quotas. People say, I'm in favor of affirmative action, when what they really mean is, I favor racial quotas. And we are very much opposed to that. Yes, that is what he means.
Then what's the role of the Commission, Civil Rights?
All right, the Civil Rights Commission, as opposed to the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which is what Brad Reynolds heads, is fourfold. It's an educational agency, it is an advisory agency, it is a research agency, and it is has been described as a public conscience. The Civil Rights Commission never has had any enforcement authority. We do not enforce any laws, we never have, we don't have the authority to do so. We hold investigative hearings, both in Washington and out in the field. We have 50 state advisory committees. There's one here in Idaho which has performed very effectively in dealing with the hate group problem here. They just finished a very lengthy report which will be published by the Commission within the next few months, detailing how effectively that problem has been dealt with by local and state officials here in Idaho. That's what the Commission does.
I would like to interrupt at this point to give you the opportunity to tell our viewers who will be watching throughout the Northwest what you're just talking about, that you do provide information to the public, but also you receive data and information that's analyzed. And so I'm always thinking of our viewers. Would you mind telling them how they could get in touch with the Civil Rights Commission if they would like to send information to your office?
If you want to send information to the Commission, either about a suspected civil rights violation, you can write to us in Washington, D.C., It's just United States Commission on Civil Rights, 1121 Vermont Avenue, Washington, D.C., 20425. We also have 10 regional offices. The one that serves the entire Pacific Northwest is in Seattle. You can get in touch with us through our Seattle office.
Very good. And if someone didn't get that, they could correspond with us, and we'd send it on to your office,
Right,
too.
or just look up U.S. Civil Rights Commission in the Seattle phone book.
Jeannie Gibbons.
Mr. Mandelman, as I understand affirmative action, what people have done to use this as a tool to create some equality is you have a situation, say we have a situation with a school where there are a large amount of black children, say 75% of the kids, the students are black. That school board uses the affirmative action guidelines as a tool to get more black teachers. Okay, they not only say, I hope a black person applies, they affirm themselves to that commitment and they go out and they recruit black teachers. Are you against that?
No, this is, as I pointed out to a group at the college that I spoke to this morning, the administration, the commission, both are very much in favor of non-discriminatory affirmative action. And by that we mean, as an example, if an employer is looking for new engineers or whatever job category he's looking for, that employer goes out and recruits at predominantly minority colleges, of which there are quite a large number in the United States. The employer or a school has non-discriminatory compensatory training programs. Say a college decides that there are some potentially qualified students out there who aren't reading yet at a college level or not be able to do math or write a composition at a college level. We have no objection to the college offering remedial English or remedial math, as long as it's done on a non-discriminatory basis. If an employer wants to upgrade his workforce and he's got a large number of minority employees in less skilled or unskilled jobs, we have no objection at all to the employer having a job training program to improve the job skills of those employees. Our only requirement is that the training program be operated on a non-discriminatory basis. To us, that is the essence of affirmative action, and to that we say not only is it all right, we think it's laudable. What we object to is an employer saying, I'm going to hire 10% of my workforce will be black, period. 5% will be Indian, 5% whatever. Quotas is what we object to. Trying to meet some sort of numerical goal is what we object to. We think that's illegal. As well as being wrong, we think it's illegal. But the kinds of programs that I was just outlining, we are all in favor of.
May I continue?
Yes.
For instance, on the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation, we have a reservation which is about 60% Indian.
Yeah.
And then we had a situation where perhaps 30% of the employees were Indian. That was a disproportionate number of Indians working for the Coeur d'Alene tribe. Coeur d'Alene tribe reevaluates this, and they in turn adopt a quota program that will be more representative of the Indian population in the area.
Well,
now, do you view that as preferential treatment, and do you see that as wrong?
well, I guess I would partly answer that with a question. How is it, I assume the Indian tribe controlled the hiring to begin with. How is it that the Indians weren't, are you telling me that the Indians were discriminating against themselves? Because
Not
that seems to be the implication. They were
No.
the ones that were doing the hiring. People, we start with the general premise, people should be hired based on merit, not based on their ethnic background or their religion or their race. That to us is the essence of what the civil rights laws are all about. Indian tribes raises a whole different set of issues, partly because under federal law, for many purposes, Indian tribes are treated as independent nations. In fact, the Civil Rights Commission is going to be is beginning to start work on a major study of civil rights enforcement of all kinds on Indian reservations. And there would even be some question about to what extent the 1964 Civil Rights Act applies to Indian tribes operating as an Indian tribe. And I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that. A lot of these questions are still pending in the courts and have never been answered before. So I don't want to go any further in responding to that because I'm just not sure what the state of the law is.
Okay, back to your original question about why would Indian tribes be not hiring their own, receiving government grants, applying for and receiving government grants, where the hiring qualifications are pretty well spelled out in the grants, where you do have a requirement to get the extremely qualified person, and within the pool of the Indian tribe, there aren't those people to fill the jobs.
Well, if there aren't qualified people, then they certainly shouldn't be hired. I mean, when you talk about Indian tribes, you're talking about, as a group, probably the most impoverished and deprived group of people in the United States. Now, I don't know what jobs it is we're talking about, but if you're talking about, for example, school teachers.
Schools, yeah.
All right. And I made this point this morning when we were talking about minority groups' objections to competency testing for teachers. The last thing it would seem to me that an Indian tribe would want is an unqualified teacher simply because that teacher could help them fill a racial quota for Indians. If you want to educate those Indian children so that they will be able to get out of poverty, get decent jobs, they have to be taught by competent teachers. Not Indian teachers, but competent teachers. And if you're going to have a racial quota, and you've already premised this question on there aren't enough, quote, qualified Indian teachers, then the implication is you're going to hire unqualified ones. That's terribly unfair to those children, on top of everything else that's wrong with it. You're injuring the very people you're trying to help.
Mr. Bandelman, this is a hypothetical. We do have some Indian teachers that are extremely qualified on the reservation. What we're looking for here is the future, and if the doors are closed on Indians who want to go on to college, and these student loan programs start tightening up, and it's harder and harder to afford a college education, what's going to happen?
Well, again, I have to come back to the same answer I gave you before. There is another problem in this country that is a threat to everybody, rich and poor, black and white, Indians and Asians alike, and that is a federal deficit. If the dollar falls apart, if rampant inflation starts again, everybody gets hurt, and inflation hurts poor people more than it hurts anybody else. That budget deficit has got to be brought under control, and that means cuts have to be made. And I'm not going to keep repeating the same answer, but this becomes the underlying problem.
Mary Lou Reed.
Mr. Mandelman, you suggest that everyone should be hired on merit, and regardless of race or creed or sex, and that sounds very good, but what do you really do if you have an 18-year-old black who is in New York City who is unable to get a job because that person has no experience? Is there not some way or some obligation that the community has, either community or government, and if you say government is community, to make sure that person is denied an opportunity which may change his or her complete life by not having a foot in the door to learn the work ethic?
Well, I'm very glad that you used precisely that example, because I think it shows up the whole fallacy of quotas. Quotas are not going to help that black youth.
But
if he's 18 years old and has no job skills, you can have all the racial quotas in the world. He isn't getting a job anywhere because he's got nothing to sell to an employer. Quotas, if they, and I use this word in quotes, benefit anybody, are benefiting a black or a Chicano or an Indian who already has marketable job skills. What's going to help that 18-year-old is acquiring enough of an education so that he's got some marketable job skills. He doesn't need a quota, he needs an education. And if you're asking me why doesn't he have an education, I say, well, we've just put him through 12 years of school at public expense. Why don't we have something? The question is, why don't you have something to show for his 12 years of education? Not why don't we have a quota for him? That's not going to do
But
anything.
his 12 years of education are not necessarily going to give him the job skills. What he needs is a job in order to get some experience, in order to learn what it's like to have a job.
Well, I don't think we're getting, this is not a chicken and egg thing. He's first got to have the job skills. I mean, I'm not talking about an attitude towards work or work ethic. I mean, he needs to know how to be a carpenter or a plumber or an electrician, or he has to have some marketable skill for which there is a demand from employers. If he's got that job skill, and if you are faithfully, in good faith, enforcing Title VII, which says there shall be no discrimination in hiring, then he will get a job, or she will get a job. But nobody, black or white, is going to get a job if they don't have job skills. It's unfortunate that our public education system has deteriorated to a point where you get large numbers of students, black and white, coming out of high school who don't have any job skills, who can't read and write on a high school level. But again, quotas aren't going to solve that problem,
They
even
might
if you
offer
believed in them.
They might offer some protection to
what?
To some protection to that black youth who may be competing completely with white youth who the employer may. I mean, this is human nature.
No,
may
wait a minute. Are you
prefer.
suggesting that an employer should be required to hire a black who has no job skills
No,
over
that's
a
not what I'm
white who
saying.
has some job skills simply because
No,
you need a quota for blacks?
I am just saying the same old thing. All things being created equal, one person is still slightly more equal than the other. I'll pass it on to
Dr.
Dennis.
Connors.
You have discussed the role of the Civil Rights Commission, and you've used the term conscience to be somewhat the conscience of the country. Some have said it plays the role of apologist for the administration's lack of doing something substantive. Would you react to that?
Well, again, this is really coming back to the argument, the non-argument argument between people on my side and people on Senator Bond's side. We say we are doing something very definite. We have taken very strong positions against quotas, against comparable worth, in favor of non-discrimination in employment. That is doing something. There are those who disagree with us and say we shouldn't have taken those positions. Well, that's their privilege, but you can't say we're not doing anything. What we are doing is something that they don't agree with. And they distort it by saying the administration isn't doing anything. Well, that's just not the case. We have a program, we have policies. Our opponents don't like that. They don't like the policies.
Mr. Mandelman, we are just about out of time. We only have 2 minutes, and I do want to get in one question. We've heard today in some of the presentations that there are some bills in the Congress at this time that we would label as civil rights legislation. Is the Commission taking a look at those? Is the Commission taking a stand, or are they going to take a stand in relation to anything?
All right. There are two bills that are pending. The only one of any that's really being seriously considered is H.R. 700. This is the bill, the third attempt at reversing the Supreme Court's decision in the Grove City case of 1984. The bill has run into a great deal of objection and criticism because it goes much further than simply reversing the Grove City decision. It actually expands federal regulatory power into areas where the government never has had any authority to regulate. And that is one reason the bill probably is not going to pass this year. The second major objection that's been brought up is sort of a tangential one, but it's probably killing the bill, and that's abortions. A number of church groups have argued that they want an exemption for religiously oriented colleges. If that denomination is theologically opposed to abortions, then they don't want to have to, for example, have their student health service provide an abortion. So they wanted an exemption put into the bill, exempting them from that particular part of it. Well, a number of the women's rights groups have objected to the idea of them being exempt.
I'm so terribly sorry to interrupt.
That's why the bill is, that argument has not been resolved, and that's why the bill isn't moving anywhere.
We're out of time. I want to thank you on behalf of our staff for being here today and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. Joel Mandelman, who is the Deputy General Counsel for the United States Civil Rights Commission. As I indicated, this is the third in a 7-week series. Please be with us again for series number 4 next week. Have a good week. I am Tony Stewart. We have to sit here on the tiles with one thing that happens. We have
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.